When the American Civil War erupted in 1861, it wasn't just a conflict that captivated the United States. The eyes of the world, especially those of Europe's great powers, were fixed on the outcome. Among them, France and Britain, the two most influential Western nations of the time, watched with intense interest. Their governments, elites, and ordinary citizens formed opinions, debated policies, and at times came close to intervening in a war that could have reshaped the global order. This article explores how France and Britain viewed the American Civil War, their political calculations, economic concerns, public opinions, and the moral dilemmas that shaped their stance on the bloody conflict across the Atlantic. 1. Britain's delicate balancing act. Economic interests, cotton versus wheat. At the start of the war, Great Britain had a powerful economic stake in the American South. British textile mills depended heavily on Southern cotton. The Confederacy hoped this would be their ace card, believing Britain would have no choice but to support them due to the cotton famine that would result from a Union blockade. However, Britain was not entirely cornered. By the time the war began, the UK had stockpiled large amounts of cotton, and it could also source cotton from Egypt and India. At the same time, the Union became a critical exporter of wheat and corn to Britain. This food supply was vital, especially after crop failures in Europe. Supporting the Confederacy could have endangered that trade. In the end, food trumped cotton. Political realism, avoiding a quagmire. British leaders, including Prime Minister Lord Palmerston and Foreign Secretary Lord John Russell, initially considered recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate government, especially after its early military successes. But the British government ultimately opted for neutrality, wary of getting dragged into a war that was both far from home and politically dangerous. They also feared the Union's response. A formal recognition of the Confederacy could have led to war with the United States, which had a growing navy and bitter public opinion toward any European interference. Public opinion. Sympathy divided. British public opinion was divided. Among the aristocracy and ruling elites, there was sympathy for the South, partly due to class alignment and disdain for what they saw as American mob democracy. Many saw the Confederacy as a proud and traditional society defending itself against a centralized and aggressive North. But among working-class Britons and abolitionists, the North had their support. Once President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the war took on a clear moral dimension. It became a fight against slavery. British workers, many of whom suffered due to cotton shortages, continued to support the Union cause, valuing liberty and abolition above short-term economic relief. 2. France's ambitions and dilemmas. Napoleon III's opportunism. France, under Emperor Napoleon III, took a more opportunistic and imperialistic view of the Civil War. Napoleon had his eyes set on expanding French influence in the Americas, particularly through his military intervention in Mexico in 1861, where he installed Maximilian I as emperor. A divided United States would have been ideal for Napoleon III's ambitions. A strong and unified United States had long opposed European intervention in the Western Hemisphere, Monroe Doctrine, and a Confederate victory could weaken American influence, giving France freer rein. The recognition debate. France was more willing than Britain to consider recognizing the Confederacy. In 1862, Napoleon proposed joint mediation between the warring sides and even pushed Britain to recognize the South together. However, Britain declined, unwilling to act without American provocation. Without British support, Napoleon III backed off. France didn't want to act alone, especially given the risk of war with the Union. Public and intellectual views. French intellectuals and liberals largely supported the Union cause, viewing it as a fight for democracy and abolition. However, some members of the elite and business class, especially those invested in imperial ventures, were more inclined to see value in a fractured United States. 3. The Trent Affair, a close call. In 1861, a Union warship stopped the British mail ship Trent and seized 2 Confederate envoys en route to Europe. The Trent Affair nearly pushed Britain into war with the Union. Outrage swept across the British press and political sphere. The crisis was defused when President Lincoln released the envoys and skillfully calmed tensions. However, it served as a stark reminder of how close Britain came to intervention and how fragile the Union's diplomatic position was early in the war. 4. Slavery as a moral wedge. Until 1862, both France and Britain viewed the war largely through strategic and economic lenses. But that changed with the announcement of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. By framing the war as a battle to end slavery, Lincoln reframed the narrative globally. Neither France nor Britain, nations that had already abolished slavery, could now justify supporting a government built on the defense of human bondage. This shift also gave the Union a major propaganda victory. Southern diplomats found it increasingly difficult to gain sympathy in Europe. Abolitionists in both countries mobilized to ensure their governments didn't lend legitimacy to the slaveholding Confederacy. 5. After the war, lessons and reactions. Once the Civil War ended in 1865, both Britain and France re-evaluated their policies. Britain strengthened its resolve to stay neutral in future U.S. conflicts and took steps to mend relations, especially after the Alabama Claims, a diplomatic dispute over British-built Confederate ships like the CSS Alabama. France suffered from its misadventure in Mexico. With the Union victorious and pressure mounting, Napoleon III was forced to withdraw French troops in 1866. The Mexican Empire collapsed shortly thereafter. Conclusion. France and Britain viewed the American Civil War through a complex web of economics, geopolitics, morality, and public opinion. Both nations saw opportunities and dangers in the outcome of the conflict. At times they edged close to involvement, but ultimately opted for cautious neutrality. Their restraint, however, was not due to indifference. The war profoundly affected their foreign policy, imperial ambitions, and domestic debates over freedom and slavery. Had either nation intervened on behalf of the Confederacy, the course of American and global history might have taken a very different path.